Hello, this is a brief 10-minute-ish presentation on the hugely concerning changes to life expectancy and mortality rates that we've seen recently in Scotland and also across the broader UK. And this is a version of a presentation given recently both to Glasgow City Council and also to a cross-party committee at the Scottish Parliament. Just before I get into the meat of the presentation, there's a very quick but rather dull definitional issue just to get out of the way. And apologies for anybody watching this who's fully aware of this, but sometimes people get a little bit confused and it's helpful to get this out of the way at the outset. So I'm going to use the terms life expectancy and mortality rates pretty much interchangeably throughout this very brief presentation, and that can sometimes confuse people a little bit in terms of whether these are showing different things. In effect, they're not really. They both use exactly the same data. And life expectancy is not, for example, some sort of prediction of how long somebody born today will live. Rather, it's just a reflection on current mortality rates, so the ages that people are currently dying at. We obviously use life expectancy because it's a much more intuitive measure when you're explaining it to people. So if, for example, you're comparing health outcomes in different areas. This is an old example from outside Edinburgh. And if you show that one area has an age standardised mortality rate of 1,492.1 compared to 1,294.5, it clearly means nothing at all. If you say, using exactly the same data, that what this really means is that in one area people are living 9 years less, it suddenly means an awful lot to people. But on the other hand, you can do a lot more analysis-wise with mortality rates. And that's why we tend to use them for lots of reasons. The more important definitional side of this is that both these indicators, life expectancy and mortality rates, are very, very good markers of the overall health of a population. And indeed, you can argue of broader societal progress. And I say the latter because in high-income countries like Scotland, like the rest of the UK, life expectancy has gone up decade upon decade upon decade. Conversely, mortality rates have decreased, improved, decade upon decade upon decade. And that obviously reflects improved living conditions and public health success stories like vaccination programs and medical advances and all the rest. And indeed, the only real exceptions to this, going back a long, long time, have been pandemics, so what we've seen in the last couple of years with COVID, and wars, and particular societal crisis in terms of what happened in Russia after the fall of communism, for example. Other than that, life expectancy has gone up, mortality rates have gone down. And that's really important background to this piece of work that we're talking about here, because the background really lies with headlines that were appearing prior to the pandemic, suggesting that this wasn't really the case, suggesting that there was a, quote, stalling of improvement in life expectancy. I'm reasonably confident in saying that for most people who saw those headlines, they wouldn't really have much idea what that meant. And even if they read the detail of the argument, which was saying that life expectancy was now no longer improving as fast as it once was, probably thought, well, who cares? Does this really matter? But for the reasons I've just alluded to, for people in public health, this was ringing all sorts of alarm bells, for the simple reason that it just shouldn't happen. Life expectancy should still be going up, mortality rates should still be going down. So that caused lots of people, including ourselves, to look into this in a bit more detail, and what emerged from the analysis was really, really, really concerning. So if you look, for example, first of all, at England, and I do this deliberately because an important point about all this is that it's not a Scottish specific phenomenon that we've seen, it's across the whole of the UK. So looking at female mortality rates in England, it's broadly the same picture for males. This is this long-term continual improvement going back decades. This chart goes back to the 1980s, but you could track this much, much further back in time. And then around the early 2010s, we see this so-called stalling of improvement, this leveling off, this slowdown in improvement. Really, really importantly, this isn't about people living in the least deprived areas. These are the 20% least deprived neighbourhoods of England. There is a bit of a change in the trend, but mortality rates, importantly, are still coming down. But it is very much about those living in the most deprived areas where, barely believably, mortality rates stopped coming down and actually started to go up. Now, there's two things to say about this. First of all, at the risk of repeating myself, in a country as rich as England, this just shouldn't happen. And secondly, this isn't the 1% or the 2% most deprived populations, those on the periphery, if you like. This is a fifth of the whole population. And that whole picture, when you look in Scotland, is exactly the same. It's a slightly different scale because mortality rates are a little bit higher, but exactly the same in terms of increasing death rates among those living in the most deprived 20% of areas. And if you dig into the data deeper, you see really, really concerning, sharply increasing premature mortality rates. This is for females in Scotland. The same data in the city of Glasgow shows striking reversal of previously sharply falling mortality rates. And I'll come back to this particular chart at the very end of the presentation. If you look in Edinburgh, clearly a fabulously wealthy city, increasing death rates among the 20% most deprived of that city among males of all ages. And if you look at premature male mortality in Dundee, absolutely dramatic changes. And all these changes have, of course, coincided with the implementation of the UK government's austerity programme, which sought to cut astonishing amounts of money from public spending and therefore really important public services. But more poignantly, cut tens and tens of billions of pounds from social security. Social security is clearly the safety net for those living in difficult circumstances. If you take that safety net away, what happens? Well, what the data seem to suggest is that people die, and they die younger, and they die in increasing numbers. Now, this is quite emotive language. So in public health, we have to be absolutely clear. Is this evidence-based? But the answer now is a very, very clear yes. And the evidence comes in sort of three levels. So first of all, there's a huge literature, evidence base, on the political determinants of health more broadly. So the fact that political decisions impact on population health. That's important. Much more relevant, though, is the wealth of the international evidence of the detrimental effect that austerity policies have had on population health. And this now comes from a whole number of different studies across a whole number of different countries, and includes this paper published recently by my colleague Jenny McCartney at Glasgow University, which, based on complex analysis, showed that across all high-income countries, wherever a form of austerity has been implemented, it has had a negative impact on mortality rates in that country. But much more relevant even than that is the wealth of the evidence that has emerged from within the UK of the impact of the particular form of austerity that has been implemented here, with that particular focus on the income of the poorest and the most vulnerable in society. And we see that impact along really well understood causal pathways in terms of increased levels of poverty. And we see that both from poverty indicators, but also from studies showing, for example, the association between austerity and increased numbers of food banks, between austerity and increased levels of homelessness, the impacts that then filter through in terms of poor mental health, and there are clear evidenced links between poor mental health and poor physical health, and that includes poor mental health of particularly affected populations like lone parents, how that then drifts through to changes at mortality at different ages. For example, these studies looking at older age mortality in England, and also different causes. This study looking at the association between austerity and increased levels of drug-related deaths across Britain, and ultimately filtering through to overall changes in life expectancy, both in Scotland and in England, and indeed across the rest of the UK. And at the end of May this year, we published a report, again led by my colleague Jenny McCartney, which was the result of a critical assessment of all that and lots more evidence. And what all that evidence shows is that the main drivers of these horrifically concerning changes are indeed UK government austerity policies. In a departure from our usual activities of writing these reports that, let's be honest, nobody really reads, we also produced a 3-minute animation, which is basically a summary of all that evidence in a more accessible format. And if people are interested in that, it'd be great if they would share it. A brief postscript to that report. For the work that went into it, we looked at a whole range of potentially relevant factors, and I'm just going to mention one here, which is about drug-related deaths. So I said earlier in this presentation that these changes, the phenomenon of these changes, has been common across the whole of the UK, and that's absolutely true. But there is one distinction between Scotland and England, and that relates to premature mortality rates, where the changes have been a bit worse in Scotland than in England. And to a degree, this relates to Scotland's much higher level of drug-related deaths that people are very familiar with. There's two things to say about that. The causes of Scotland's higher levels of drug-related deaths are very well understood. A lot has been published around them. And actually, one of them, to bring this back in a slightly circular fashion to what I've been talking about, is also about the clear effects that austerity has had on drug-related death rates. So I mentioned just a second ago that particular study, but possibly more relevantly and more poignantly, if you speak to people in addiction services working in Scotland, they will talk about how if you have a vulnerable population with addiction issues and you take away their income, either by reducing it through cuts to social security or taking it away completely through sanctions, then people, in their words, and I'm quoting people in their words, they look for oblivion. And if you look in the data, there are some horrific examples of precisely that. So if you look, for example, at drug-related deaths among men in Glasgow, the red line here are those living in the 20% most deprived areas of the city. Within a year or two of austerity being implemented, people sought oblivion. This is Glasgow, but we actually see this across all of Scotland. So on a slightly different scale, because among females death rates are lower, this is the picture in Aberdeen, for example. Again, this dramatic change within a couple of years of austerity being introduced. The penultimate point I want to make in this presentation, the trends I've shown here are all pre-COVID. I will show one example just in a second of updating the trends to take into account the two COVID years. But they're obviously massively important context for understanding the scale of the inequalities that we saw in COVID. Some of the media reporting around COVID inequalities was, I think, a bit surprising in the sense that I heard journalists expressing surprise that we had such inequalities in COVID when it was a virus that was affecting the whole population. But clearly, if you live in one of the most unequal high-income countries and you've had 10 years of policies which have exacerbated those inequalities, if a pandemic comes along or just the next disease of the day comes along, you will clearly see massive inequalities in that pandemic or the next disease of the day because of these underlying structural vulnerabilities. So it's no surprise, therefore, that we saw the scale of inequalities in COVID deaths that we saw. This is a picture for Glasgow, but it's the same everywhere. And it's also no surprise that if we update some of these trends that I've shown you to include the last couple of years, we see a continuation of this really, really concerning picture. So this is the example I showed before, showing premature mortality rates among females in Glasgow, with this dramatic reversal of previously falling trends. So if we just update these to include the last 2 years, i.e. the COVID years, we see a continued worsening of those trends. But I think what the important point about this is to take a step back. This is quite an extraordinary picture, because if you go back 10 years, then what you see here is that in Glasgow, a city renowned for relatively higher mortality rates and poorer health, what this was a success story in the sense that mortality rates overall were coming down, but coming down much more sharply among the more deprived populations. So in other words, this is a picture of a narrowing inequality. Fast forward 10 years, and we see this, and death rates among the most deprived 20% of females in Glasgow under the age of 65 are now actually higher than they were 20 years ago. This is unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. What do we do about it? Well, in the report published at the end of May, we included a whole range of different policy recommendations, and these were based on previous policy recommendations that we've made and policy recommendations made by other organisations, and you see some of them on the screen there. And we aimed them at 3 layers of government, as it were: UK government, Scottish government, and also local government. And they were based around all sorts of different themes. You can see them there on your screen. I'm not going to go into any detail here. You can have a look in the report. Important to say that while the main recommendations were aimed at the UK government in the sense of reversing what has been done with austerity, which has impacted on population health so badly, we also highlighted the fact that there was lots of things that, for example, the Scottish government could do with their existing power. So in terms of protecting the poor through introducing new or increasing existing social security benefits, through narrowing income inequalities, which would have a knock-on effect of narrowing health inequalities, and that could be done through more progressive taxation effectively, and also various measures around housing aspects. And there are other recommendations in that report. In speaking to colleagues at Glasgow City Council, we also highlighted recommendations made in the report regarding what local government can do to kind of mitigate some of these things that are going on, and a few of those are shown on the screen there, and again are included in the report. I'll finish this presentation in the way I finished it when speaking to colleagues at the Scottish Parliament and in the City Council, in saying three things. The first is that as researchers, we're not naive. So I'm personally long enough in the tooth research-wise to know there's a huge gulf between recommending something be done in policy and actually seeing that implemented in policy. We're not daft in that sense. The second thing is that we're aiming the key recommendations at the UK government. And for obvious reasons, that's quite difficult and unlikely to see much happening there. And the third reason is, or the third thing to say is that in asking local government or asking Scottish government to do things here, we couldn't possibly be asking at a worse time in terms of the current economic situation. But despite all that, and given all that, we still need to do something, don't we? Because this, as I've said, is barely believable and absolutely unprecedented. And the widening of inequalities that we've seen in the last 10 years is much, much worse than we saw even going back to the period post-1979, which has been highlighted in a lot of previous research. So we need to do something. My email address is there, Jerry McCartney's email address is there, and if you want to see the report and the animation, that's on the website. Thanks for your time in watching this presentation. Cheers.